Okay, so we start off with this. This is, I'm not an artist, but I'm going to try my best. This is a motor neuron.
Now, are motor neurons just always there? That's not anything that's being sent. That is
No,
an actual
that's-
thing.
Yeah, that's
there.
part of the nervous system.
Okay, okay.
And so signals travel down. It's how the brain communicates.
It's like the little finger from the brain that says.
Yeah, it's how the
Okay.
brain is communicating with the muscle.
Okay.
And you can realize it's going to be, communicating with muscle. The fact that it's a motor neuron, motor for movement, so it's
Okay.
dealing with the muscle. So
Okay.
the brain sends a signal down the motor neuron.
Okay.
Once it hits the end of the motor neuron, it releases a chemical. There's a bunch of these chemicals. As a general group, they're called neurotransmitters, but this one in particular is called acetylcholine.
Okay.
So it releases acetylcholine.
Okay.
Now, inside our muscle cell, we have these little cylinders called myofibrils. There's an organelle that wraps around it, and that's called the Sarcoplasmic Reticulum. That should sound a little bit familiar to you because we learned about the endoplasmic reticulum, which in muscle cells, the sarcoplasmic reticulum is the endoplasmic reticulum in muscle cells. Does that make sense?
Okay, but the endoplasmic reticulum doesn't wrap around anything in the.
In normal cells,
cells.
yes. But it's been adapted in muscle cells, and so we have a little bit of a new name, but
But it does the same job.
yeah. So
Okay.
sarcoplasmic reticulum has a bunch of calcium in it. So it holds onto this calcium.
Okay.
Now in the myofibril, we have a bunch of these units called sarcomeres, which is just the space between these lines, which are called Z lines, which makes sense because it's kind of like a Z shape.
Okay.
But there's a bunch of these little segments called sarcomeres, and they're made up of two types of fibers. We have our actin and our myosin. Okay.
So next to where you've got Z lines, there's gonna be some that line up to that and some that line up to that.
Yeah, so
Some
there's
are
gonna be
just
some
continuous?
on like this side too. So there'll be another Z line,
Okay,
like and that
Okay.
that idea.
so they just all like chain link up?
Yeah, there's a
Okay.
bunch of them. So the acetylcholine comes down, and the whole purpose of acetylcholine is it signals the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release the calcium.
What you're showing me right here is just one muscle cell, or this is a muscle?
This is a muscle inside a muscle cell. Because muscle cells, so here's a muscle. You have a muscle bundle.
Okay.
You have a muscle cell. You have a myofibril. It's just a bunch of cylinders. It's all of these are cylinders. Does that make sense? It's like you go from one big cylinder, you go even tinier, tinier, tinier. So we're inside a muscle cell. We're talking about this guy right here.
Oh,
So we're at the tiniest level.
okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So, the acetylcholine, its whole job is to signal sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium. The reason the calcium is important is there's like a shield or covering on the actin that doesn't let the myosin heads grab onto it. That covering has to be removed by the calcium. When that calcium removes that covering, the myosin heads are then able to grab on to the actin. And it's all, every single one of them has these little heads, they're called.
That little line in the middle has little things that.
Yeah,
can
the
go-
myosin, yeah, they're called myosin heads.
Okay.
And if this is actin and this is my myosin head, it reaches up and pulls like this. Does that make sense?
Oh, so it's more like
so-
just kind of pulling it along, not
Yeah.
just attaching to it.
Yeah, so it's pulling and grabbing again, pulling, grabbing again. So it's pulling these two Z lines closer together. Does that make sense? Like it's pulling them closer together.
Okay.
And when we contract the muscle, that's all that's happening. That muscle's condensing. It's contracting, it's
every
condensing.
little tiny cell is doing that.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And that's why when you flex, you know how it gets a little bulge? It's because it's compressing all that into a tiny space. So all these units are compressing inside the muscle cell because the myosin is grabbing onto the actin. Now the myosin can only grab onto the actin when the calcium's been released to remove that covering on the actin. So right now it's contracted because that calcium's been released and the myosin head's grabbed on. To relax a muscle, you have to get rid of that calcium to put that covering back on. Or because as long as that covering's off, that myosin's going to be grabbed onto the actin.
So after it pulls, does it only pull within those Z lines then?
Yes.
Each one only pulls within its own space?
Yeah, in its own sarcomere space, yeah.
And so then the actin is like running over itself in that space?
It's more like, yeah, these two ends of the actin fibers will touch. They'll get close together. So like, if this
Because
is,
when it's relaxed, that myosin makes up the gap between the actin.
yeah, so let's say it's like that, and you have your
Okay.
myosin heads grabbing on. The end result would look something like this. Hang on. And the myosin would still be in the same spot, but they're pulled closer together. Does that make?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So, as long as that calcium's there, it's going to stay contracted, which is not good. You know, sometimes we want to let our arm down or we want to relax a muscle. And so, to get that calcium back, because there's a high amount of calcium there, a low amount out here, what transport do we have to use to go from low to high? To put it back into the circuit. Active, exactly. So active transport has to be done to pump the calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So,
And it's low out there because just enough is released
Yeah, exactly,
to allow.
exactly.
Okay. It doesn't just keep coming. It's just
Mhm.
enough,
Yep.
and then it goes back.
And so it actually requires energy for, one, the myosin heads to pull, so to contract, but it also requires energy to relax the muscle because you have to pump that calcium out into the sarc. So it's a really weird concept of, to relax, you actually have to use energy to get that calcium back in the sarcoplasmic
So
reticulum.
once the calcium goes back, then those myosin heads just completely let go and
The-
it just snaps
the-
back?
yeah,
Or does
that-
it continue, does it do that slow process?
It's a slower process,
Okay.
but it's like the covering it starts to put back on so the myosin heads can't grab on, and so that the actin, and so they
It just
can't.
kind of scoots back.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, and so it goes back. Example of how we can see this, like, I don't know, have you ever seen like a road-killed deer? And you see the legs like straight up in the air?
Mhm.
It's because when you're dead, like you have no control over the calcium, so the calcium just was released in the muscles, so it tenses them all up. So there's actually a condition called rigor mortis,
Right?
when right after a person dies, they get really tense. It's because all that calcium's being released and not being drawn back up. You have to wait for it to wear off to be able to let their muscles relax. Because as long as that calcium's there, they're gonna be, contracted really tight. So
Okay.
does that make sense about
Mhm.
muscle contraction? That I just explained. I know it's a lot of information. It's muscle contraction and relaxation all in one, right there. Lots of new vocab.
Yeah, I need to copy that picture though, because that picture makes more sense than what I saw in class.
So,
Okay.
but does that make sense with the actin and the myosin and their
Mhm.
relationship?
Mhm. I was trying to figure out when he was talking in class, I was trying to figure out how, because he's like, well, then these contract, and I'm like, and they slide over each other and all this stuff, and I was like,
Yeah, does the sliding make sense now? Like, it's
Mhm.
pulling it over. The
well, and I
myosin.
wasn't understanding that the myosin was through the center of them.
Yeah,
And so then I was like, well, I don't understand where that's
Mhm.
coming from, but okay.
now it makes sense? Because the myosin doesn't move. The myosin just stays where it is. It's just pulling it, the actin is close
So
to
it's stationary.
Yeah.
The
but
myosin
the
never
myosin, the
moves.
myosin doesn't
Only
move. Because
the-
it's just pulling the actin close together. Like right here, you see, I tried to make it so,
Right.
but the actin gets
So the
pulled.
mysin's like a stationary pole
Yep,
that can pull
Pull.
when it's given permission because
Yep.
there's calcium.
exactly.
Okay,
Exactly.
that makes sense. It's kind of crazy to think, I'm trying to still think whole muscle and to think that that's one little
Little
tiny
part.
muscle
Yeah.
fiber.
Yep, it's called a myofibril. It's inside a muscle cell. Yeah. The amount of stuff your brain's doing every second, just by moving your hand to the right, you're doing this stuff right now. Because your brain is sending signals to contract different muscles at different times to move your pen.
Oh, that makes my brain hurt just thinking about it. And this is why it's so short, PJ. Oh, okay.
Yep.